Now we're going to look at figure 8.3 in Ehrenberg, and this figure is going to look at what Ehrenberg calls isoprofit curves for one particular employer. So let me explain that. We begin with, we've got this one employer here, and it's a factory, and all these workers are coming to work, and train is leaving with a product that the factory makes, and this poor slob is just falling off the top of the factory. So this is a factory that makes stuff, and it has a chance that workers will get hurt in the factory while they're busy working. Now let's take that thought and bring it over here to these curves. Let's just look at this curve here, and for the moment, so we're going to look at this curve right here, and we'll call that curve P1. And what this curve says is that there are different combinations of risk, say for instance R1, and wages that that employer is going to have to pay, say W1. And over here is a higher level of risk, say R2, with an associated higher level of wages, W2. And so if this employer sets up his factory so that the risk level is R2, then the employer is going to have to pay his workers a higher wage rate. On the other hand, if the employer sets up his factory where the risk in the factory is lower at R1, the employer will get to pay a lower wage rate. And so the question becomes, why would the employer ever choose point M instead of point N? And the answer to that is that in this factory here, safety costs. So for instance, to keep this poor guy from falling off the smokestacks here, you'd have to put in some guardrails. There's some nice guardrails here designed to keep workers from falling off the top of the factory. So we have these great guardrails, and that costs money. To further ensure that nobody falls off the top of the factory, you're going to have to tie the worker in by a rope of some sort so that if the worker falls, he doesn't crash to the ground. And tying the worker in costs additional money. You got to pay for the guardrails, you got to pay for the tie rope, and then furthermore, when you tie the worker in, that prevents the worker from moving about on the top of the factory, and every time that the worker wants to move, he has to move his tie rope from here to over here. And the basic story is that low levels of risk mean you have to have various safety systems, and that the safety that you embed in your factory costs money. And so it may be that the employer might be willing to go from a high-risk system to a low-risk system in order to lower the wages he has to pay from W2 to W1, but some employers may not do that because that level of safety going from R2 to R1 might cost more money than that employer will save in lowering wages from W2 to W1. Now let's look at the difference between this isoprofit curve, which is, we'll label this P1. What's the difference between this isoprofit curve here and P2 here? Well, the answer is that P2 is a preferred isoprofit curve compared to P1, because at any level of risk, let's say call that level of risk R2, on P2 the employer has to pay W2, but on P1 the employer has to pay W1. And if we call this line here P3, up here again for the same level of risk the employer has to pay a higher wage, W3. So P3 is the less preferred isoprofit curve. P2 is preferred to P3. I'm sorry, P1 is preferred to P3, and P2 is preferred to P1. And there are an infinite number of curves in here. Ehrenberg has just picked out 3, and basically he's saying that the line P2 allows for more profits. The line P3 is really a line that is associated with losses. So here we have loss, and here we have gain, and this line here, P1, is kind of the boundary between a whole bunch of curves associated with loss and another whole bunch of curves associated with gain. I'm sorry I let those two cross. That's a bad thing to do. They're parallel to each other. They don't cross. And so what Ehrenberg is saying is this line is a unique line in that it is the borderline between a huge number of combinations of risk and wages that are associated with a loss, and a huge number of combinations of risk and wages that are associated with above zero profits. And so that's what he is doing with figure 8.3 and its foundation.